good evening. I'd like to welcome you to the fourth of our 5 Wednesdays in May lecture series on the history of radical social movements in Ireland. This series has been organised by Occupy University, Dublin Community Television and the Ireland Institute. I'm Helena Sheehan. I'm a professor at DCU and organiser for Occupy University. Tonight we're going to look at the Irish Soviets, which I think are constitute a really interesting chapter in the hidden history of Ireland. I remember my surprise when I discovered that the red flag was once flying over the Rotunda and then all over the rest of Ireland as well. I think that more recently the T.G. Cahir production on Soviet Naharan has done a lot to restore the social memory of the Irish Soviets. And Conor Kostick, whom we have here tonight, was a consultant and interviewee on that series, whom you might have seen. Conor Kostick is a lecturer in history at Trinity College. He's the author of many books, both fictional and factual. The one most relevant to the topic here tonight is this one, Revolution in Ireland. He's also served as chair of the Irish Writers' Union, and he's a member of the Socialist Workers' Party. So, Conor.
Thanks. So thanks to Helena and the organisers for inviting me to speak on this topic. I always enjoy giving these meetings and have never yet got an invitation from academia to speak on it, but fortunately there is still an audience for Soviets in Ireland elsewhere. And also thank you all for coming in the nicest evening of the year so far to discuss this subject. So, as Helena said in the introduction, it comes as a shock. I mean, I know most people in this audience are quite well informed, but perhaps you can recall the first time you heard that there were Soviets in Ireland, and it does come as a shock when you hear that. A pleasant one if you're on the left, and as you start to investigate the subject, it really is surprising the depth and militancy of the working class movement in the period that produced the Soviets, 1917 to 1923. And when one thinks of the sort of conventional narrative you get for this period, it's absolutely dominated by the idea that the revolution years in Ireland were essentially nationalist years where people were mobilised either politically by the Sinn Féin party or militarily by the membership of the Volunteers, the Irish Republican Army. And it's this narrative that explains why Britain conceded a measure of limited form of independence to Ireland. It's a very dominant narrative. And I want to argue that there's a whole missing dimension to this. And what produces the Soviets in Ireland is a combination of, it is the national question, and perhaps we should discuss how important that was, because if it was a crucial component of the Soviets, then we're not going to, that works against the idea there might be Soviets in the future, because the national question isn't in the same format as it was then. But I'm going to argue more optimistically that we might see them again. And so there is a national dimension, and then there's of course a massive social dimension and working class dimension. And the first sign that something remarkable might happen in terms of Irish working class militancy occurs in 1918 when Britain tries to conscript Irish males. And there's been a big offensive launched by Germany in the March of that year. There's a desperate need for manpower, and the British generals who are dominating the cabinet at the time say to one another, why should Irish males be exempt from conscription? We intend to drag 300,000 of them into the trenches to serve our purposes. So they actually pass the legislation, they draw up the plans to implement conscription. And the fact that they don't conscript a single person, the fact that the conscription bill is entirely defeated, is down to the working class intervention on the question. Because on April 23rd of 1918, there was a massive general strike in protest at this possibility. Now, I have to say that the nature of the strike is not as radical as one imagines when one hears the phrase general strike, in the sense that the Irish middle class and even sections of the Irish elite were also in favour of the protest. After all, they don't want their sons and brothers and so on being conscripted to the trenches either. And so there was definitely workers are pushing at a relatively open door. But nevertheless, it was very, very impressive. And the Irish Times summarised it as saying that this was the day on which the working class would realise its strength. They were quite right as well, that the solidity of the strike, the fact that nothing moved in Ireland for the day, woke workers up to their own power and infused workers, and we get a whole rash of economic strikes in the wake of this successful political intervention by Irish workers against conscription. So it was enormously successful, and I would say that there's different ways in which working class radicalism can emerge. Sometimes it sort of builds up gradually through lots of small strikes, giving confidence, but sometimes it comes as a result of a big political crisis that galvanises people into action. In the times that we live in, I think it's more likely that Irish working class activity takes a sudden leap along the 1918 model. Just one, button pressed too much, one issue introduced that's just the straw that breaks the camel's back, and you get a big explosion rather than a whole series of small strikes. But I could easily be proven wrong on this. But I'm just pointing out to you the political crisis can often create the space, especially when the ruling class themselves are divided, in which the working class can make their first intervention in years. So out of a very low level of strike activity, you suddenly get an enormously solid and successful general strike. And this creates a lot of enthusiasm inside the working class movement to repeat the strength. And I'm going to diverge slightly from, but it's only very slightly from the main investigation of the Soviets in Ireland, to talk about the North for a moment. Because I think obviously the North is politically absolutely crucial anyway, but even in the Soviet terms, there's a very important strike from January to February of 1919, and this is of northern workers, primarily in engineering, for shorter working week. They've seen their conditions of life disimprove quite substantially during the war, and in winter they have the misery. If you work 54-hour weeks, which I did very briefly, and then spent the rest of my life trying to avoid being put into that situation. You're too exhausted to enjoy the hours that you have outside of work the way you should. So naturally enough, there's a great desire from the northern workers and indeed their Scottish equivalents to have a shorter working week, and they're bold enough to go for 44 hours rather than 54. And this is important for the Soviet movement because they cut all the power to the city of Belfast, and then they released it block by block, to unit by unit, only to those areas of Belfast that needed it, say, to run the hospital. So they literally controlled the power. They had the power of the city in their hands. The Belfast mayor, later, when he was sued by small business for failing to supply power and services, his defence was all of these the services and the power supply were in the hands of the Soviets. Where the Belfast Telegraph dared to try and siphon off some of this electricity to keep their presses running, the strikers in their hundreds grouped outside the Telegraph and eventually bricked in the windows and silenced that newspaper for the duration of the strike. And transport was not moving except by permission of the strike committee. And so you get the label Soviet. Now, it wasn't a takeover of Belfast and a declaration of self-government by workers, but in fact it was their enemies really who described it as a Soviet, or at least those unsympathetic to it. But the lesson wasn't lost, amongst the workers themselves, that they had a taste of control over the society. So this is the Belfast authorities, the British representatives in Belfast, telegraphing back to Westminster, to the cabinet. The workmen have formed a Soviet committee, and this committee has received 47 applications from small traders for permission to use light. So it's their opponents are calling them describing what they're doing as a Soviet, and it's not totally far from the mark, except that it lacks one very important quality that a genuine Soviet should have, which is a democratic input from the strike. The strike committee in Belfast is a rather conservative body of 137 people, so a very big, rather unwieldy body, mainly made of people who are full-time officials of unions. So there's no recallability on these people, and that does lead to problems in their strike. They were, on the whole, though, they started the dispute very well. They took real efforts to not let sectarianism divide them by appointing a Catholic leader, Charles Mackay, even though the majority of them were Protestants. And they, in their propaganda, in their newspaper and so on, they made a big effort to say we are not getting religion dividers, which was very important. But they did lose. They didn't win as much as they could have because of the conservatism and lack of recallability of the strike committee. Ultimately, the test came down to their attitude to the British troops, which were deployed on the streets of Belfast against the working class, rather than against nationalists at this moment in history. And whilst some of the strikers were in favour of agitating and confronting the troops, not physically, but in terms of mass pickets and risking the troops opening fire, the majority of the strike committee did not want to do that. And they were aided in discouraging that militancy by a lack of response from the southern trade union leaders. And all-Ireland solidarity with what was happening in Belfast, I think, would have won them the 44. As it is, they had to settle for 47, which is pretty good. I mean, if we all had 7 hours knocked off the working week tomorrow, we'd be laughing. But they actually had felt discontented and betrayed, the majority of strikers. They felt they could have got the 44 at that point. But I mean, that's a very interesting topic, and it has important lessons for challenging sectarianism. But it would be a mistake to spend too long, because it's not as impressive a Soviet as some of the ones I'm going to come to shortly. And perhaps the most impressive of all, and the best known one, is the one I'll talk about next, which is that of Limerick in April, 2 weeks in April 1919. Now here we have an example where the national question is definitely a politicising element to the formation of the Soviet, because what triggers it is the attitude of the British authorities to the Limerick region. They had in custody an IRA officer, Robert Byrne, and while he was in military guard at a hospital, his comrades tried to rescue him. A gun went off and Robert Byrne died. It was widely believed at the time that his guards had a shoot-to-kill policy. Any effort to get him out, and they would just shoot him. And it was believed that this is what had happened. Now, it turns out that might not be what happened. He might have actually accidentally got shot by someone on his own side. But the sense of injustice, certainly anyway, the British authorities were having, we know they had a policy of killing militants, and they abolished the coroner's courts in order that there would be no investigation of some of these murders carried out by the Black and Tans. So I mean, it might have been accidentally shot with his own side, but the popular perception wasn't completely wide of the remark that there was such hostility towards the IRA officers that many of them indeed would have been earmarked to be killed. So as a manifestation of anger at this, there's an enormous march for his funeral. The British authority, General Griffin, panics and decides to try and quell the discontented population by introducing a pass system. Every person who crosses the bridges into and out of Limerick, they have to show a pass to the soldiers who are stationed on the bridges. And this is what prompts the Limerick Soviet. The Trades Council convert themselves into a Soviet in name and declare a general stoppage in protest at the military passes. Completely solid, absolutely observed without anybody attempting to undermine the strike. And again, even the middle class initially quite sympathetic to the idea of abolishing these passes. Not the Irish upper classes, though. They are absolutely horrified at this militancy, and that's one of the factors behind its ending. And the strike starts off extremely well because the authorities try and cow the people of Limerick by saying that this was going to lead to famine, this protest, because the food supply is going to break down. And the newspapers are full of this argument. And there's a press release coming right from Dublin Castle saying, we will not take the consequences of the breakdown of food supply to Limerick. So they're really trying to scare people. And the strike committee does something magnificent in response, absolutely impressive to read about. You can't help but grin when you come across the materials. And that is that they march up to a Canadian grain ship in port and they relieve it of 7,000 tonnes of grain. Thank you very much. This has been expropriated to deal with the potential for hunger here. They then give the bakers special dispensation to make the bread. And when you combine that with two other measures taken by the Soviet, one is that all the creameries are on strike, so there's milk not being converted to cheese and yogurt and so on. So that milk is flooding the Limerick very cheaply. And the other measure is that they post a list of prices so that no farmer, in particular the well-to-do farmers, but also the shopkeepers, can take advantage of the hunger scare, by putting up prices. And they post cheap prices for foodstuffs around. And anyone who dares try and raise the prices found themselves also expropriated. The farmers would have the stuff taken off them, and that was a lesson to all the others. So surprisingly enough, workers in Limerick had not eaten as well in the 2 weeks of the Soviet as they'd eaten for a generation, because the free bread, cheap milk, cheap vegetables. So there was terrific, and it enormously consolidated the authority of the Soviet over the town that they had solved the food crisis. The transport was entirely in their hands. You had to have a permit to drive through Limerick during this dispute. And media very quickly came under the control of the Soviets. There were a lot of newspapers in the town because there was a transatlantic flight competition going on. When the initial response to the Soviet was hostile from some of the papers, the Soviet went to their hotel of the journalists and said, unless the journalists take a more respectful tone towards the Soviet, we're cutting off your supplies, your power supplies, food supplies, and that did the trick. But just to reinforce it, they produced their own newspaper. Similarly, perhaps most impressive of all, money ran short, naturally enough, runs out of circulation, because no one's gaining any on the weekly pay packets, and of course the British government and the banks are not distributing any money. So the Limerick Soviet produces its own, and this is a fantastic measure. And you can still see the results of it in the museums, or even if you just Google images, Limerick Soviet money, you'll see their 10 shilling, 5 shilling notes, promises to pay the mayor, and these were absolutely honoured in the shops at the town. So they solved all the great questions of daily life. They were the sovereign body, the authority of that town, and it is a wonderful inspiration that workers can take over and run their community. There was no crime. Crime dropped to nothing in the Soviet, because in the petty sessions when they resumed, had no cases arising from this period. There was no... The sense of communal struggle was so strong that the petty criminals dropped into the background. And all looked very, very promising for a tremendous victory against the military passes. It really did look like the British were going to have to abandon the pass scheme. But they were saved, unfortunately, the British authorities, by unlikely allies. Well, perhaps not in the benefit of hindsight and living as we do today, but in their times it came as a shock. But the leaders of the trade union movement, who, after all, we've got to remember, were close friends of James Connolly, Larkin. They had an aura of tremendous radicalism, but they were in a panic about this, Limerick events. People like Tom Johnson, William O'Brien, had started to see the trade union movement emerge with great resources and wealth and assets, and politically they wanted to consolidate this rather than risk it all in a revolution. And they are early models of the sort of Congress type mentality that we're more familiar with now. But it caught the people, the strikers of Limerick, by surprise, and they were outmaneuvered. And again, I don't really have time to go into it, but the Limerick strikers kept on being told there is about to be a general strike in your support. There's about to be, we've just got to do this, we've just got to do that. We're going to move our headquarters to Limerick. and the excuses dragged the thing out until a new crisis came when the coal supplies ran short. And this time the Limerick Soviet did not rise to the occasion because the coal owners, the people who had the stocks of coal in Limerick, were Irish, and they didn't take them on and they didn't expropriate them. And having failed to do that, there's a sense of unease comes into the movement because who is going to control the power supplies? There's a weakness which the trade union leaders of the day exploit and manage to bring about a return to work. It's a return to work that perhaps might not have happened if this had been a more Russian-style Soviet. In Russia, something that the strikers wouldn't have been too familiar with, although some Russian materials were circulating in Ireland at the time. In Russia, the Soviets were based on factories. So you meet your representative every day. And if you disagree with their policy, you can change that within 24 hours. And we do see in the history of the Russian Revolution 24-hour periods when the composition of the Soviets changed quite dramatically. This is sort of in the 1918, 1919 period. They decline quite rapidly after that. We don't see the same in Ireland because this is a trades council, so it's only meeting monthly, so there isn't the same input from the rank and file into it. So Limerick, sadly, is a defeat. They sign a compromise where the employers of Limerick can issue the passes, not just the British military, but it's still unfortunate. They still feel this sense of defeat that they have to show the pass at all. But it's not the end of the high point of the Soviets in Ireland, and this comes the following year with a strike to release men and women, men actually, who are in the Mountjoy jail, who've been arrested without trial and have gone on hunger strike. The initial hunger strikers are mostly socialists, but they're quite soon joined by their Republican colleagues in Mountjoy jail, and you have about 90 hunger strikers singing rebel songs, including socialist songs at night, refusing to take food, breaking down some of the walls, interior walls of the prison, and taking over wings and so on. And the plight of these hunger strikers is met with a terrific response by the working class movement in Ireland. A general strike is declared in solidarity with these hunger strikers, and this leads to the most impressive, sweeping and dramatic series of takeovers of Irish towns. And I haven't got too long left, so I'm just going to spend what time I have left on giving you some of the eyewitness accounts of what these Soviets look like. So, I mean, we're talking about, I don't know, 100 or so. So it's absolutely extraordinary. This is Galway. Well, the Workers' Council is formed in Galway, and it's here to stay. Godspeed the day when such councils shall be established all over Ireland and the world, control the natural resources of the country, the means of production, distribution, and run them as a worker knows how to run them for the good and welfare of the community, not for the profits of a few bloated parasites. This is a trade unionist writing back to his headquarters. Cavan, the ITGW official, writes back, cattle fair dispersed, shops closed, protest meetings held, resolution passed, red flags, and workers demand the release of all Irish prisoners written on flags prominently displayed, GPO closed, pickets posted, town hall commandeered as headquarters, permits issued, and so on. Charleville is a similar story. Drogheda, one is met with the same story everywhere. Shops closed. This from a newspaper rather than the trade unionist. Business suspended. It's an amazing spectacle carried out at a night's notice in a moment's deliberation. Manchester Guardian on Waterford. The city was taken over by a Soviet commissar. I mean, you know, this is great stuff to read about when you discover it for the first time, that Waterford had a Soviet commissar take over the town, and 3 associates. The Sinn Féin mayor abdicated. The Soviet issued orders to the population, which all had to obey. For 2 days, until a telegram arrived reporting the release of the hunger strikers, the city was in the hands of these men. And I mean, there's a lot of these, but the one that I particularly liked came from Bagnallstown, a trade unionist writing back a report on how it went to his headquarters. We took full control of all food supplies and saw to the proper distribution of food, and only allowed the shops to open for 1 hour a day, issued permits to men drawing from mill, and those whom the strike committee considered were justified in working for an hour. And this is handwritten on lined paper in pencil, and at the bottom he's written, P.S. On the second day of the strike, we held a public meeting on the market square and publicly proclaimed the establishment of a provisional Soviet government to police this town, to keep order and ration out food supplies. So this tremendous wave of Soviets, I mean, absolutely hidden history is right. It's a joy to read about the fact that workers are taking over Ireland. It offers a glimpse for a moment of a different scenario to a partitioned Ireland, because a working class socialist Ireland, Soviet Ireland, you can see beginning to emerge from the shadows of these movements. But it ends in victory. The British authorities climb down humiliatingly and release all the hunger strikers. At first they try and make them sign a document, the hunger strikers say no. So then they rather pathetically read the document to them as they leave, and the document says we'll come back for trial at a due date. Of course nobody turns back for trial. And when you read the British press at the time, the press are howling with anger at the British government for appearing so weak. But indeed they were. There are other this is the high point, but there are more local Soviet activities, more economic ones than these big political struggles. In particular, in 1920, there's a wave of creamery occupations in Munster, and again in 1922, a recession starts, and the workers' solution to this recession, especially again in the creameries, partly I think because of the leadership offered by a number of individual revolutionaries who were in favour of Soviets, was to take over the creamery Soviets. But on the whole, the Soviet experiment, the period of Soviets comes to an end with the Civil War. Civil War is very bad news to the working class movement generally, because the Free State government has an anti-working class agenda as well as an anti-republican agenda, and the working class failed to respond to the very difficult challenge. Admittedly, it would have been really hard, but they fail because they're led by the O'Brien and Johnsons of this world. Larkin's still in prison, James Connolly's dead. But where they have radicals involved in the movement, such as the syndicalists you might have heard of last week, John Dowling and Sean McGrath, or the revolutionary socialist Jack Headley, they do have they rise to the challenge of a massive recession combined with a conservative Free State government. And once again, we see waves of very small occupations in Soviets, some of them which are victorious, but all of them ultimately end when Free State troops prove victorious. The Free State troops invariably broke up any factory occupations or ranch occupations that they came across. So the era of Soviets comes to an end with the victory of the Free State. But they've left an example which I think is crucial for us today, when people are pessimistic about resisting the global powers that be. You quite often hear people being pessimistic about the Irish working class, but it's great to remember that the Irish working class has in its traditions such examples of massive militant takeovers and the potential to run society through their own instruments of government rather than trying to take over the structures we have today. So that would be, for me, the main conclusion. And whether you think this is exceptional and won't happen again is a fair question because of the importance of the national question to this movement. But my own position on this is that yes, it can happen again. The national movement is an example of the type of issue that can polarise people into taking action. But there's other issues, such as too much taxation on the working class that might trigger revolts. So I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you very much, Conor. We really could do with a bit more exactly that at the moment. I'll open it up to the floor for questions and comments. Could I just first ask Conor, did you say 100? How many?
Well, it depends how you add them up. I like to give the big number, but first of all, the hunger strike of May 1920. Yes, I would say, I don't know, you're talking 50, 60, and then you can get to a figure of 100 if you add up all the creamy ones all down the Shannon area.
Okay, that sounds good. Okay, it's open to the floor. Kieran.
Thanks very much for the talk, Conor. Really interesting. I think especially following on from Emmett's talk last week, where he talked about syndicalism at roughly the same stage, and he had a really interesting comment in that talk where he said that by the period of sort of 1919, 1920, post the Russian Revolution, politically the left in the Irish trade union movement was Bolshevik, but its practices were syndicalist. Because it still had that tradition of Larkinism in terms of how it went about things.
Yeah.
Do you think that influenced things, or how conscious, you mentioned that some of the Soviets weren't very consciously Soviet, why were people choosing this particular tactic at the time, and was it something that was very much adopting a Russian model that they had sort of read about or heard about, or were there deeper roots in using this particular tactic, do you think?
Yeah, good question. And I wouldn't necessarily give you a definitive answer because that's a hard question to investigate. But I would say, first of all, there's a high level of consciousness about events in Europe and Russia. We should give them credit for following these things quite closely, and this is reflected particularly in the official Labour paper, which went Watchword of Labour and its various other incarnations as it was banned. They actually, Cathal Shannon was editing, and although he's one of these O'Brien, Johnson, ultimately his loyalties are with the trade union bureaucracy, he's very good at talking left and enthusing left. But that does mean that he gives big reports, for example, on the Italian factory occupation in 1920, and discussions of Soviets are quite enthusiastic. We also, Jack Headley, when he was arrested and put in Mountjoy, and he was one of the people who kicked off the hunger strike, he had a copy of Lenin's State and Revolution in his pocket that was cited as evidence against him. So there is a connection and a thirst for knowledge about what's happening there. But I don't think any of them had actually seen a Soviet, and so they were interpreting it through the syndicalist tradition. And I think that's a good formulation that Emmett gave, that they wanted to be Bolsheviks, but what they understood as Bolshevism, with the advantage of hindsight, we can say, well, actually, there's differences. They were inclined in Ireland to not see the importance of rank and file compared to the trade union officials. Mind you, no one in Europe was particularly clear about that issue at the time. And also, a lot of the trade union officials of that day were genuine revolutionary syndicalists. And where they were in place, they led very militant Soviet takeovers. But the key difference is the one I mentioned earlier, that there's not the sort of daily connection with your representatives. I don't know how well that answers it.
Sam, are you indicating? Yeah.
Okay. I don't need that. Listening to the talk, I get the impression that the Soviets, as you mentioned, were based on more short-term militancy about certain issues, rather than an overall vision of changing society as such. That even most revolutionary of the Soviets, were even the Limerick one, was based on a political idea of opposition to Britain and the British Army and what we're doing. And the others arose from actual strikes. And when there was a solution to the immediate problem, the Soviets collapsed in the sense of being Soviets, and we went back to status quo.
Yeah, I think that's a good generalisation. And it raises the question, which has just occurred to me now, and I invite other people's thoughts on this. Why, when the Russian ones sort of began in the same way, the 1905 ones, which perhaps the first ones in history, were printers wanted payment not just for letters but for punctuation as well, and they ended up triggering this massive Soviet movement. Why in 1905 and then again in 1917 did the Soviets stay after the trigger moments, the bread riots in the 1917 case, had ended? The Soviets stayed, whereas in the Irish ones, you're right, when the prisoners were released, and in fact, I didn't read them all out. There's a good one from a teacher that says, obviously we want the prisoners to be released, but what a shame we have to stop doing this. So they dispersed, they voluntarily, And I guess partly it's the thing I said earlier, that if you're rooted in a sort of daily democracy, you might choose to keep going more easily than if the local trades council thinks the job's done. Perhaps the depth of crisis wasn't quite the same as it was in Russia in 1905. And I wonder how important the active role of conscious revolutionaries is saying, look, this is great, let's keep this going, let's extend it, let's deepen it. You know, perhaps the subjective factor is crucial in these things. I mean, they've cropped up in history quite a lot, and some of you will know more about the Spanish ones, or the Chile, they had cordones in the rise against Pinochet, and in Hungary, 56, they came about until they were crushed by the Russian invasion. And so the question is, what makes a Soviet stay? Because ultimately, if you're going to change society and base it on working class power, these organisations have to stick around and start taking on governmental duties, not just winning strikes.
Surely it's having intellectual tradition and a political movement that has a wider vision and influence to, you know, win adherence to that wider, longer vision.
Except, yeah, that's got to be part of the answer, except that the Bolsheviks weren't too keen on them when they first sprang up in 1905. So it wasn't the Bolsheviks who kept them going. No, they did in 1917, but because they'd learnt the lesson by then. But there's something more, and you see, there was no, in Hungary in 56, I don't think there was any organised left saying all power to the Soviets.
Did in Germany and Hungary and there
1918,
was a
1919.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Europe had the advantage of the 1905 experience, but by then.
The question one of the
Yes.
state that
We get you the microphone here.
the big thing, of course, is partly syndicalism believes, you know, that much like Bolshevism, but differently, you know, they take over. The line given, which in what was for many people the Bible of the syndicalist movement in Ireland, was socialism made easy, the rise of the unions, the smashing of the shell of the political state, and then taking over. But certainly one was not, I think Johnson in particular, to a certain extent O'Brien and the others, were acutely aware that the weakness of the working class in Ireland at the time, and they didn't really have any perspective of winning the small farmers, the peasants, small peasants, you know, in agriculture. And later that was shown again, of course, in the 1930s, when they just handed over the annuities movement to Fianna Fáil. And to that extent, the idea was, particularly with O'Brien, to build the organisation. We are not really ready for it. But in the meantime, Sinn Féin grabbed state power, or rather grabbed the claim to state power. There was dual power from about 1919 with the founding of Dáil Éireann. There were moments when you can say there was a period of what I might call triple power, with sort of the Soviets in various places, particularly, as you have said, the strike in support of the hunger strikers. But always there was this idea that, you know, we could leave we shouldn't try and take state power too soon, and in any case, you know, how are we going to smash the shell? It's rather interesting that nobody really got the sort of noticed that in fact the proportion of workers in Ireland, it was much the same as the proportion of work to the population of Ireland. It was much the same as the proportion of workers in the population of Russia, in fact, which is, you know, admittedly, though there again it was distorted by the fact that whereas you have Petrograd being one of the woolen towns being the main centres, in Ireland the industrial working class was very much in Belfast, and where it was very much divided, which was one of the factors weakening the strike there, of course, that there were a large contingent of unionist workers inevitably. And though we can certainly fault the leadership, in this matter we can certainly fault the leadership of the Labour Party in Trade Union Congress, it was partly that the unionist workers on the committee blocked any positive answer to offers for help from Dublin. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Do you want to respond to that, Conor?
No, that's
No.
very comprehensive.
Pretty authoritative. Lawrence?
Especially because of the tradition of Connolly and the Citizens' Army. So the Citizens' Army gets subsumed into the IRA. And I think if you look in Limerick, you see the combination of that, because the head of the IRA in Limerick was also a trade unionist, you see. So you had the two factors coming together. When you look at the reaction to Sinn Féin, like Arthur Griffith, to the lockout, I mean, they were quite reactionary. They were bitterly anti the lockout. But I think that I wouldn't say exactly co-opted it, but they made an alliance with the Labour movement, and it was a very, very successful alliance. But there was an internal tension within the movement, because they were contradictory forces, like especially when Collins was quite reactionary in terms of the social movement. So he made comments about, for example, the democratic programme. He wasn't happy about it, looked like communism and all this, but they were very happy to use it, because it brought the Labour movement on board. And then you see things like the train strike, the way that. But I think, do you know anything about Tralee? Because Tralee was another example where they surrounded the town and they tried to starve it out. Now, there was no reaction in Tralee. I mean, the black and tans were outside the shop stopping the people selling bread. And in them days you could starve in 5 days, really, because there was no storage of food. So the interesting thing is, why didn't that kick off in Tralee? I don't know when did Tralee, because I'm not sure of the history, when did Tralee come in? Because there was another siege like that in Tralee, wasn't there? And I got press coverage all over the world. They did the same thing. They blockaded the town and tried to starve it out.
I don't know about that. I don't know that incident.
Yeah.
I know Tralee participated very effectively in the 1920 strike for the recent hunger strikers.
Yeah.
And I did read, because I know someone, Kieran, some of you will know him as well, based in Tralee, who did a little pamphlet about the Tralee labour history, which I don't recall him describing a sort of army blockade of the town, but they had a lot of militant strikes of the era, as you'd expect, and I think they took a full part in the proceedings, as far as I recall. What impact did it have on this movement that a lot of the activists were also IRB members, say, or had roles in the national movement? Well, I think there's a contradiction there, and that it was ebbing and flowing, and that you could say to some extent the working class movement was pulling national activists to the left. So Padda O'Donnell and others who come out of the IRA eventually end up socialists. But then you could say the opposite's happening as well, that some militancy is being dampened down by their loyalty to organisations like the IRB. So I think Cathal Shannon was IRB, as well as being a very prominent Labour leader. So I feel it's ebbing and flowing, and that when, for example, Limerick Soviet was at its height, the IRA was looking with tremendous respect to the working class, and individual IRA members were supporting it. But when it was defeated ignominiously, then they're quite scathing of the role of Labour, and they're pulling activists back the other way. I don't believe that it's, sometimes you hear the argument Ireland could never have been socialist at this time because of the strength of national ideology. But I don't think that's true. I think, funnily enough, Ireland in some ways was better placed than other countries in that it had traditions coming from Larkin and Connolly. It had the lockout of strong independent working class voice. But you'd have had to have challenged them for leadership of the movement. There's almost an amusing, if it wasn't so tragic, quote from an American journalist who was in Limerick for the Soviet when she talks about Tom Johnson. She says, thought by many to be the coming Lenin of the Irish Revolution, which shows how her assessment was so far of the mark. But he was posing left, and it was plausible that the left could supplant the national movement. And the Irish Times said, after the general strike to release hunger strikers, that this shows that the Labour has the real muscle for the national movement, and that the activities of Sinn Féin are no more than the beating of a butterfly's wings against iron bars. So if they're drawing that kind of conclusion, it was there, that position was there to be won, but there was very few people who were actually consciously organised and articulating it.
Okay, anyone else? You and then Mary.
Thanks. I just wanted to ask, was there an equivalent movement, if you like, in the UK at the time, like Soviets developing like what was going on in Ireland?
Good question. As far as I know, no. No.
There was a moment during the invasion of the Soviet attempt to
hands off Russia.
The Poles, that in Liverpool and places that they took over the docks and places like that, and were able to stop Britain committing itself to the anti-Soviet invasion. That was in 1920.
It's strange because it was so many other places in Europe.
Yeah, I mean, the Irish rail workers' refusal to move British Army and their equipment was inspired by this, by the hands-off Russia movement in London. The dockers refused to ship equipment out to help the counter-revolutionary armies. But I don't know that that Britain ever rose to the heights of these kind of activities that was happening in Ireland. And that's, of course, that begs the question, why not? And off the top of my head, I couldn't say. I think the weight of their trade union leadership was heavier, so they're more able to quell this kind of activity. But in 1919, they had their own wave of strikes that were very radical.
Mary.
I was just wondering about the question of ideology. I don't know much about it, but when Louis Bennett, the General Secretary of the Irish Women Workers Union, when she was writing in the Irish Citizen, and she was talking about working women standing up, agitating for equal pay and so on. And she says that in the present structures, when the organisation of society puts such a burden on the working class man, we have to be careful. But then she says, when the cooperative commonwealth is established, everything will be changed. And that sounded like kind of an overall ideology. And then in the democratic programme, whatever was really intended by it, it does try to commit the Republic to cooperating with governments of other countries to bring in legislation that will be in favour of the lives and conditions. I was just wondering, is there an ideology that sees Ireland working in an international way in any way to establish a socialist commonwealth? Or?
Yeah, well, you claim not to know that much about it, but you know more than me. There was a very good book, Charlie Maguire, Roddy Connolly and the Struggle for Socialism in Ireland. I feel investigates this question of international relations between, the Johnson O'Brien wing would be more interested in a second international alliance with the equivalents in Labour, which is not for a socialist world really, although they would say it in rhetoric, but they've all just fought on behalf of their own countries. But the radicals on the far left, so Roddy Connolly and even James Larkin, would be looking to the Russian Revolution as their international hope. I don't know enough about Louis Bennett. She crops up quite a lot in my book, but I've yet, I think she's a good subject for a biography because of her militancy, and her role in the women's movement. So it sounds like she was looking for something more like Roddy Connolly was looking for than Tom Johnson.
There is a biography, by the way, by Rosemary Culnones.
Thanks. Yeah. I
don't know how much she goes into the thinking.
Well, what's your own feeling then having read that on her ideology. Is she?
No, I should read more. I know, you probably know, hasn't Ellen Hazelcorn, isn't that her name? She's written a study. I haven't read it all, I must say, yeah.
There was a book, I've heard a paper, but it was not published, by another woman, Mary Carolan, some years ago on Louis Bennett. But my impression is that Louis Bennett, the term cooperative commonwealth was general around. There's an article once quoted by I think Tom Garvin of all people, in which he quotes Ernest Blythe as saying, "We want a cooperative commonwealth." And Ernest Blythe's career in politics was not exactly conducive to that. So it was an idea, an aspiration rather than a programme. Right.
Can I just come back to Michael Collins? Actually, you mentioned him as a reactionary in the Democratic Programme. I'm not sure you've got that right. First of all, I think was it Sean T. O'Kelly who said it made his gorge rise and he wanted the socialist phrases stuck out. I don't think it was Collins. I think Collins is more interesting than that because it's a bit easy to if he was always conservative on the social question, then it's less tragic what his role than if in fact he had quite a good class instinct, which I believe he did. And it's more interesting to say, why does someone with fairly healthy respect for the working class traditions turn so viciously? I'm very interested in that question.
I think he was quite right wing in his social policy.
I don't get that. I mean, so you're getting a few nods, so maybe some of you know more of this than me. But for example, I was reading some of the military bureau materials about the 1916 period. Someone arranged for a meeting with him in a pub which had pickets, and he was furious that they would do that. He was absolutely reactionary as head of the Free State, no question. And when you look through the minutes, there's a disproportionate attention to strikes and breaking the power of union. So I'm just saying that I don't think in his youth he was that inclined. And when you look at the organisation he built, one of the reasons he built such a good intelligence system is he had respect and paid attention to the working class people who were coming to him from the post office or from the secretaries in the castle and so on to build his intelligence network. So
that's exactly what I was going to say. That was the main impetus for it's the resource. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but primarily he was an organizer for everything, like the resources. There's one story. I think the TEU went to get, when they were set up, went to get a building, and they shared the building with him as a front.
Yeah.
He was very aware of this kind of networking.
Yeah.
And no better networks than the trade union movement for all the best reasons, but
yeah.
I think that was the main motivation was, perhaps.
Yes, you, and then you.
I'll just kick off. The Citizen Army was mentioned about 10 minutes ago as something that seemingly disappeared after 1916. But it's my understanding that the Citizen Army, albeit not very well organised and not very clear about its role on a day-to-day level, did continue on and into the 20s. There are a number of reports of people operating as Citizen Army and as adjuncts, I suppose, to the IRA at the time, rather than the notion that's put upon a lot of history books that the Citizen Army on, Easter Monday 1916 ceased to exist, became part of the IRA. And then, of course, I believe there was some of the veterans of the Citizen Army were involved in Mick Price's attempt, I think it was in 1934, to refound the Citizen Army as a left-wing or workers' army. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. My question is, given the momentous nature of what people were doing, like a direct challenge to the ruling authorities, to everything that was seen as normal and natural, and that it was coming by and large from the bottom up, was ordinary people, many of whom had never been involved in anything much before. Did anything remain in terms of increased or decreased confidence? Like, what was the effect on the labour movement, whether it be in large towns where stuff happened, or indeed some of the very small villages like Knocklong and Castleconnell and so on? But given that there were a huge number of occupations, many of which where they ran up the red flag, in a generalised way at least, saw themselves as part of a left-wing movement, what remained from that in the years that followed?
What did they do with all the red flags?
Sadly, they made quilts out of them or something, other than use them. Yeah, it's a really important question, because whether or not you think Ireland could have gone, could have had a working class revolution or not, which is a big what if, you can certainly ask why don't we see more tangible, lasting evidence from this period? Because in Italy or France, especially Germany, even though the German revolution is defeated, you still get communist parties, hundreds of thousands of members coming out of it. These, like you say, people who've never been radical before, having had a taste for it, and also being angry at the defeat, then joining and committing themselves to a lifetime of support for the left. We don't see the same in Ireland. And I suppose there's two factors here. One is demoralisation. Defeat is damaging and discouraging, and it takes a long time to pick yourself up. And there's a definite increase in apathy after serious defeat in any part of the world. And we have to acknowledge that the working class, by the end of this period with the Free State government, are defeated. And I think the second factor is that out of the ruins of that defeat, you could still have constructed quite a big radical left-wing party, but you'd need a core of people to get it going. And the book I mentioned about Roddy Connolly shows that they made that perhaps people like ourselves, if I can generalise about your politics, but if something like this happened, I'd like to think we would all be rowing in behind it and trying to build it. They made a hames of it. For one reason or another. Now, to be fair to them, it was a really complicated situation, and their analysis of republicanism, for example, I think was quite weak. So that Roddy Connolly offered 6 out of 8 pages of his newspaper to the Republicans, so a sort of uncritical siding with Republicans, whereas I thought a better position when I read it was that offered by James Larkin. He comes back too late to build anything or shape it, but his position was, yes, we're against the treaty, but there are working class ways to fight against the treaty. We don't have to adopt the Republican position. But anyway, so on issues like that, they were quite weak, and they also were outmanoeuvred. O'Brien was very, very skillful in keeping the left from forming and crystallising into a distinct rival party that could challenge Labour. So, so a combination of the subjective with the demoralisation, I think means is the answer to your question. I don't believe, as some people argue, that the lack of anything to survive out of it, or not very much to survive out of it, means it was never that radical in the first place. That's a conclusion you could draw, that it really wasn't. We're exaggerating, we're all exaggerating, but I don't feel that. I think that the militancy really was there, but then it was dissipated like steam.
I've seen a lot of militancy in the past that's dissipated in my lifetime.
Yeah, I just wanted to reference back to something you said at the beginning, like it was, has things changed now that the national question is so changed, you know? Well, I think maybe it hasn't completely, you know, like one thing Rory Quinn and people like that are very fond of saying to people when they're cutting them, says, the state is in receivership. Now, my understanding of receivership is it's been taken over from outside. You know, and that's quite true. Like, I mean, the last budget was discussed in Germany rather than here before. Yeah. First, you know, and the Troika dictates on a month-to-month basis how the state is run. So there is an element of, you know, a question there of who runs the place. And in the past, the radical tradition was, you know, you refuse to, you know, it is an occupation of some sort. The radical tradition was you refuse to recognise the occupation and you organise against it. Yeah. Now, unfortunately, and also historically, a government that administers for an occupation like that has been characterised as a quisling government. Now, I don't know what you'd call the labour movement in terms of its service to this, because the Croke Park Agreement has not been found to be in any contradiction with the Troika. So to have another quisling for quisling And recently, recently David Begg said in regard to the ESM, which is an even more extreme form of outside control, it's completely unaccountable, completely beyond scrutiny, completely beyond immune to any sort of criminal scrutiny or charges, if whatever it does. David Begg said in relation to the treaty that Ireland is a laboratory in which more and more extreme forms of neoliberalism has been tried out, and that social Europe has been dismantled. Now his attitude to that was we do nothing, and that attitude in general has been we'll do nothing. Now it does prove something else, that the level of self-activity and the level of self-organisation of workers is practically zero. But it also proves that these people have reached a level of impotence that the only thing that you can say to them is to go. So we're in a sort of, an interim period where the people who are keeping the working class down have nothing to say to them, no excuses, and the time for actual reorganising, self-organisation is actually now. It's not. It just shows me ignorance of the period. I can't really reference much about the period. So.
No, I agree with you. I think it's a good way to look at it. You get periods, revolutionary periods occur when the ruling class have got no safety valves, and they make mistakes, and they have let them eat cake moments where people say, "Whoa," and even moderate people who've never done anything in their lives say, "I've got to come out now." And I feel that there's elements of that in the picture. I'm not sure they've fully matured yet, but the IMF are telling the government you have to do these things. The government probably think to themselves, the chances of getting away with that are quite slim, but okay, we've got to do it. The master has spoken. So they're introducing, the household charge. They might lose that battle, could easily lose that battle. Very, very, the more strategic people in that cabinet must be saying, remember the poll tax and the Tories. To themselves anyway, they've got sleepless nights over this, but they're going to do it because the IMF tell them to do it. They're going to do everything that the IMF tell them to do, and that means they're going to make mistakes. And maybe they've already made them, and we're already. Future historians will say we've already passed the point at which that things started to spring back to life inside the working class movement. So, and I feel that, like you began, I feel that can provide an equivalent context to the political crisis of 1916 to 23 in terms of the national question. It could. That could be something else. It could be an environmental issue that affects the whole planet that triggers something. It could be, I think it's quite inspiring what the people of Iceland did in a modest way, and it can go a lot further. But things like, it could come external to Ireland and then flow in. As the way the world is, we're all very integrated in terms of protest movements now. So I'd be cautiously optimistic. I don't see this as such a distinct situation that it can't recur.
Sam?
Sorry, just a question was asked, but now will I start? The Citizen Army. I was reading Emma O'Connor, we had him here last week. His book, The Irish Labour History, the history of Irish
A Labour History of Ireland.
Labour History of Ireland. And he reckons that 124 members of the Citizen Army fought in the Civil War on the Republican side. And after the Civil War, they seemed to disband. Second point I want to make is that why did this movement go down after the Soviets? Most of the people involved in the Soviets were members of the Irish Transport and General Workers' Union. And they mirrored the highs and lows of that union. That union reached the zenith 1918, 1919, maybe 1920. But by 1930 it had gone down. And it reflected the collapse of the union, relatively speaking. The third point I want to make is this, that we didn't have a political party of the left covering those years. the Irish Trade Union Congress and the Irish Labour Party were one organisation up to 1930. Now they changed name at some stage to the Irish Labour Party and Irish Trade Union Congress, but it was the same party. When the Anglo-Irish Treaty was agreed in 21, the Irish Congress of Trade Unions became neutral. They adopted a neutral stand. And there were a number of Labour deputies, well, trade union deputies, including Tom Johnston, into the Dáil, and they were neutral. And it had an effect on the whole development and the progress, in my opinion, of development of the working class as a conscious section of society. I'm just thinking that of all the European labour movements, we are one of the most complex. Because into that mix we haven't mentioned tonight, Larkin came back from America, and geez, it created chaos in the country between O'Brien and myself and all that was going on. And it's no wonder like that we hadn't the straight line. Trade unions, political parties and the working class went up, you know, a graph. Anyway.
No, I agree with you. Yeah, it is like that. You did stimulate lots of thoughts that I felt I could say something useful about. Yeah, but I'll pass. You know.
One of the things I think about is in terms of the numbers of people we had on the streets addressing the taxation system in 1979 and 1980. And what people were protesting against at that time in massive numbers was small in comparison with the situation now in terms of private debts being taken into public ownership and our taxes just being frittered away to private bondholders and to pay private debts. Why has that not? The outrage, you know, it's far more outrageous in comparison with 1979, 1980, where presumably our taxes were, you know, being used inside the country. Whereas now they're going out to pay private debts at the expense of our public services. If that doesn't bring people out in the streets, if that doesn't, you know, stir the trade union movement up to bring people out in the streets, you know, what can? And the household charge thing has been, you know, effective in its way, but it's a tiny little tax. I mean, we had no resistance to the universal social charge and other more unjust taxes. I think the reason why this has you know, caught on is because it's resistible, whereas our other taxes come out of our wages with PAYE. But, you know, if this situation that we've been living through in these past few years doesn't get people to rise up in comparison with other things in the past where they have.
The tragedy is, Selina, for the past 30 years we have been educated by our lords and masters to think inside a very narrow little box that, you know, I mean, it's, people are actually saying, you know, we can't, for example, we have to have cuts. We can't tax the rich more than they're being taxed. You know, these are the ideas that are being done. Of what is called the neoliberal marginalist economic school. There is no alternative, and though people want an alternative, people believe somewhere at the back of their minds there is an alternative. They're being shouted down when they try it. And one of the good things about this crisis, or at least the possibilities in this crisis, and one that should be taken up, is that it gives us the opportunity, and we should, I'm sure that Conor's campaign and everybody else here should start thinking outside this box and starting asking more serious questions about the society. But in '79, it was the end of a period of considerable social unrest, which came out in the tax marches. Now, hopefully, it is the end of considerable social regression, I think is the word. And that is the answer. We've just got to try it.
Well, we have had a left out there, raising these questions, but we've just been so marginalised, and yeah, we know, but we all know well.
I feel a bit less marginal these days. I do think, not necessarily in a narrow political sense, but some of the ideas that I would believe in, that society should be run for need, not profit, those kind of ideas, very, very popular, I think. There's a sense that would be nice, but it's not going to happen. But at least there's a sort of, what you describe as the domination of the free market economics, that they have been discredited, and we're in a slightly new era ideologically. And I think it was Trotsky who perhaps coined this image, but it's certainly a very useful one, is that, what triggers an avalanche? It's not the moment when the bird claps its wing. I mean, it is the moment. The clap triggers the sound, triggers but really what triggered the avalanche was the accumulation beforehand. And I feel we're in that kind of a period where there's an accumulation of anger. It's really building up. And sooner or later, we'll have that moment where we find a really strong expression. Now, it might come from a group of workers who, I think, I still have a lot of hope in, say, the ESB, the power workers. And so there's the small groups of workers who have not ever really been beaten and have a lot of power in terms of stopping the country. Maybe it's something like that, or maybe it's something more on the streets. And the Occupy movement was very exciting for that, because you thought, well, maybe this could tap into that general discontent. And I don't know if you discuss amongst yourselves what next, but but anyway, the avalanche is building.
I think that's a good image. I like that. Kieran.
Something, just in this conversation that really strikes me was last year I was at a meeting of a group, knowledge exchange, or maybe provisional university, and was talking to them about the anti-globalisation movement. And nobody else in the room had ever heard the phrase temporary autonomous zone, which 10 years ago was this idea of seizing spaces. So if we don't even have the memory 10 years later to look at Occupy in the context of this theory, I think it's really important that we take ideas like the Soviets and let people know about them, because we not only need to have that moment, we do need to have tactics and tools and a heritage, and I think that's been lost hugely. And it was one of the things that spurred on this talk series, which was this idea that people know they want to do something, but they don't have examples to look to. And I think that's hugely important, the type of research that Conor is doing, is to give those examples.
Exactly. Right, anyone else? Conor, anything else you'd like to say?
Great, thanks.
Okay, we'll wrap it up. Thank you very much, Conor.